For centuries, Indian Jews carried a story that seemed almost impossible to prove. They said their ancestors had crossed thousands of kilometers, leaving the ancient Jewish world and eventually building new communities on the western and southern coasts of India. But where exactly had they come from? When did they arrive? Were they descendants of a tiny group of ancient Jewish refugees who somehow survived for generations in isolation? Or had Jewish migrants mixed with local Indian populations and created something entirely new? Historians argued over those questions for generations because the written record was incomplete. Oral traditions sometimes reached deep into legendary history, and India itself contained several migration waves from whose histories were completely different. Iraq, then scientists began reading their DNA. Future research could therefore make today's story even more precise. The genomes of India's Jews reveal something much more fascinating. These Jewish communities really do carry Jewish ancestry connected to populations from the Middle East, but they also carry substantial ancestry from the Indian populations among whom they lived. Migration, the Bene and Israel of Western India, and the timing of major genetic connection to Jewish populations alongside strong Indian ancestry, early modern periods, with the principle necessarily reaching unchanged, estimated at roughly 650 to 1,050 years ago. The Cochin Jews of Kerala show a similar pattern, with significant Jewish DNA has taken a story that at approximately 470 to 730 years ago, including ancestry connected to Yemenite, Sephardi, and broader Middle Eastern Jewish populations. In other words, the DNA did not uncover one secret Indian Jewish race. Identity. It revealed several communities created by migration, marriage, isolation, and cultural survival. Perhaps that is the biggest surprise. And the deeper scientists the Indian Jews were never simply Middle Eastern people who happened to live in India, and they were never simply Indians who happened to practice evidence of becoming Indian. They became something while remaining historically unique. To understand how Jewish population is, two histories entered the same communities, often mixed together. One came from the ancient Jewish identity, one came from South Asia, and Indian generation after generation. They are not the same. Survived. Jewish communities. That is why the DNA results are so powerful and Mediterranean. They do not erase the stories and later spread throughout told about themselves. North Africa, Central Asia, and other regions. As these communities settled in different places, their genomes changed. The Bene Israel genome tells us that a community carrying people usually married within the community really did inherit others experienced significant admixture with surrounding populations. Indian. As a result, there is no single genetic profile that defines every Jewish population. Through historical migration Ashkenazi Jews and mixed Sephardi local ancestry, Mizrahi major Jews, detectable Ethiopian Jews, roughly Yemenite Jews, and Indian Jewish communities all have different genetic histories. What connects these populations is not perfect genetic uniformity. It is a combination of shared ancestry, community history, religion, culture, and traditions preserved over generations. Indian Jewish DNA fits into that larger pattern, but it has its own distinctive story. The first major clue came from the Bene Israel, one of India's best-known Jewish communities. Their traditional history says that their ancestors arrived on India's western coast after a shipwreck, eventually forming a small Jewish population around Maharashtra. The story was preserved orally for generations. The community continued observing Jewish traditions while living among surrounding Indian populations. But historians could not determine exactly when the original migration occurred or whether the traditional shipwreck account preserved a literal historical event. The absence of extensive early records made the question especially difficult. By the time modern genetic studies began, researchers had several competing possibilities. Perhaps the Bene Israel were descendants of ancient Israelites who arrived in India thousands of years ago. Perhaps they were mostly local Indians who adopted Judaism. Perhaps they represented a mixture created by Jewish migrants marrying local Indian women. DNA finally provided a way to distinguish between those possibilities. An early problem, however, was that Indian populations already contained substantial ancestry related to populations west of South Asia. This broad ancestry component is often discussed through the concept of ancestral North Indian ancestry, itself connected to ancient populations related to groups from Iran and the broader Eurasian world. Therefore, simply finding Middle Eastern-looking DNA in the Bene Israel would not be enough. Scientists needed to determine whether their non-Indian ancestry was specifically related to Jewish populations or whether it could be explained entirely by the ordinary West Eurasian ancestry already present across South Asia. That distinction became the central challenge. Researchers therefore conducted a genome-wide study of 18 Bene Israel individuals and compared them with hundreds of people, representing Jewish, Indian, Pakistani, and worldwide populations. Rather than relying on one marker, they used several independent analytical methods. Principal component analysis examined overall genetic similarity. Admixture estimated ancestral components. Identity by descent analysis looked for shared DNA segments that can reveal more recent common ancestry. Additional methods estimated when populations mixed. This was important because a single similarity measure can be misleading, especially in a genetically complex region like South Asia. When several independent methods pointed toward the same conclusion, the interpretation became much stronger. The Bene Israel were clearly admixed, and the ancestry contributing to them came from both Indian and Jewish-related populations. The result was almost exactly the kind of genetic profile you would expect from a small migrant community that spent centuries inside a much larger surrounding population. Bene Israel individuals clustered close to Indian populations, showing that their Indian ancestry was substantial. Yet they were also genetically distinctive from neighboring Indian populations because of an additional component linked specifically to Jewish populations. In other words, they were not simply local Indians. But neither were they a transplanted Middle Eastern population that remained genetically unchanged. Their ancestors represented two histories meeting in India. The most important detail was the timing. Researchers estimated the major detectable Jewish-Indian admixture event at approximately 19 to 33 generations ago, roughly 650 to 1050 years. That date was younger than some traditional stories suggesting an extremely ancient arrival in India. But this distinction is essential. Genetics can estimate the timing of a detectable admixture event. It cannot automatically identify the exact date when the first Jewish person ever reached India. A small group could have arrived earlier, remained relatively isolated, and then experienced more substantial mixing centuries later. Therefore, the study did not simply say, the Bene Israel arrived in India 650 years ago. It showed that the major genetic mixture that shaped the modern population occurred around that period. Then came another fascinating discovery. The Jewish ancestry was stronger through the paternal side than the maternal side. Their mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mothers to their children, was predominantly associated with South Asian lineages. Their paternal ancestry contained stronger Middle Eastern and Jewish-associated signals. This pattern is consistent with a demographic process in which Jewish male migrants contributed substantially to the community, while local Indian women contributed strongly to its maternal gene pool. We should not turn that statistical pattern into a detailed story about individual marriages, because DNA cannot tell us whether particular relationships were voluntary, arranged, economic, political, or the result of other circumstances. But at the population level, the sex bias tells us something important. The formation of the Bene Israel involved interaction between incoming Jewish ancestry and people already living in India. That finding transformed the old debate. The Bene Israel oral tradition was not completely confirmed in every detail. Scientists did not discover the wreckage of an ancient ship or identify one specific village in the Middle East where every ancestor originated. But they did confirm something much more fundamental. The community carried genuine Jewish ancestry. At the same time, its genome was unmistakably Indian. The two identities were not competing explanations. They were both part of the population's biological history. Then researchers turned to Kerala. The Cochin Jews of the Malabar coast had an entirely different historical tradition. Some community traditions place Jewish settlement in Kerala extremely far back, sometimes as early as the era associated with King Solomon. Other traditions connect Jewish arrival to the destruction of the First or Second Temple, while later historical theories point toward medieval migration. Archaeological and written evidence becomes much clearer from the medieval period onward, but the earliest origin remains debated. Once again, genetics offered the opportunity to separate deep tradition from detectable demographic history. Researchers studied genome-wide DNA from 21 Cochin Jews and compared it with hundreds of individuals from other Jewish populations, as well as dozens of Indian and Pakistani populations. They found a pattern remarkably similar to that of Bene Israel, but with an important difference. Cochin Jews genetically resembled local Indian populations, yet they also possessed a substantial Jewish genetic component that was not found in neighboring Indian populations. The analysis identified significant recent Jewish gene flow roughly 13 to 22 generations ago, approximately 470 to 730 years. The Jewish contribution was associated particularly with Yemenite, Sephardi, and broader Middle Eastern Jewish populations. That timing immediately created a fascinating historical connection. Kerala was one of the major trading regions of the Indian Ocean. Ships moved between southern India, Arabia, Persia, the Red Sea, and East Africa. Jewish merchants participated in those wider commercial networks. A Jewish family did not have to travel overland thousands of kilometers across Central Asia to reach India. It could travel by sea through an interconnected maritime world. The genetic data therefore fit naturally into the geography of the medieval Indian Ocean. Jewish people from the Middle East could arrive in Kerala, settle among local Indian communities, establish families, and gradually develop a distinct Indian Jewish population. But once again, they did not remain genetically Middle Eastern. Cochin Jewish DNA is strongly Indian as well. That fact is crucial. Researchers explicitly found that the genetics of Cochin Jews resemble local Indian populations. In some analyses, Cochin Jews actually fell closer to the Indian genetic line than to many other Jewish populations. That tells us that centuries of life in Kerala mattered. These were not simply foreign Jews living temporarily on the Malabar coast. Their population history became deeply connected to India. At the same time, the Jewish component was not simply the same West Eurasian ancestry already common in South Asia. Scientists used admixture dating and population comparisons to identify evidence for Jewish-specific ancestry. The estimated timing was considerably more recent than the ancient mixing events that produced broad South Asian ancestry components. That made the argument much stronger that Cochin Jews preserved a genuine Jewish contribution than simply inheriting ordinary West Eurasian ancestry like many other Indians. And there was another clue. The Cochin Jewish population showed strong evidence of endogamy and a population bottleneck. Endogamy means a community tends to marry within itself. Over many generations, this can preserve shared DNA segments and make a community genetically recognizable. A bottleneck means the population became relatively small, causing some ancestral lineages to become disproportionately common. Together, these processes help explain why scientists can identify Cochin Jews as a distinct population today, even though they possess substantial Indian ancestry. Their Jewish identity survived because the community preserved itself socially, and that social structure left a genetic signature. This is an important point because it changes the meaning of genetic isolation. Isolation does not always mean pure ancestry. A population can contain ancestry from multiple sources and then become isolated after its formation. The result is a community with mixed ancestry but a distinct genetic identity. Bene Israel and Cochin Jews both illustrate this beautifully, although their histories are not identical. A broader genetic study of Indian Jewish populations reached a similar conclusion. Researchers examined high-resolution autosomal, Y chromosome, and mitochondrial data from Indian Jewish communities and found a minor but measurable Middle Eastern-specific ancestry component that was largely absent in nearby non-Jewish Indian populations. They also found that maternal lineages were overwhelmingly South Asian, while paternal lineages included both Indian and Middle Eastern associated ancestry. This again points toward a complex history involving Jewish migrants and local South Asian populations. But then science revealed something even more fascinating. The Indian Jewish story was not one migration. There were multiple migrations. Different communities had different histories. Different Jewish populations arrived through different routes, and different communities mixed with Indian populations at different times. This means there is no single Indian Jewish DNA. The Bene Israel have one genetic history. Those later migrants often arrived in circumstances that are much easier for historians to document. Their ancestry is therefore different in character from the older Indian Jewish populations. They did not necessarily experience centuries of isolation within India before modern records existed. Their migrations occurred during periods when European colonial and commercial networks generated far more documentation. And that contrast helps us understand something fundamental about ancestry research. The older the migration, the more difficult it is to distinguish history from later community tradition. The newer the migration, the more likely it is that DNA can be matched with written records. That does not mean oral traditions are useless. It means they must be tested carefully. The Bene Israel story provides a perfect example. Their oral tradition of Jewish origins existed long before modern genetics. The genome eventually supported the central claim of Jewish ancestry, but it did not necessarily validate every traditional detail about when or how the ancestors arrived. Genetic science, therefore, did not replace the tradition. It refined it. The Cochin story shows the same thing from a different direction. Some traditions describe extremely ancient origins. The genome detects strong Jewish gene flow in the last several centuries. That does not mathematically prove that earlier Jewish visitors never reached Kerala. It shows that the major detectable contribution shaping the modern Cochin Jewish population occurred later. Historical and genetic evidence, therefore, need to be combined rather than forced into a single date. And there is a wider lesson here about Jewish population history. Jewish communities often survived not because they remained genetically unchanged, but because they maintained identity despite changing genetically. Ashkenazi Jews developed substantial European ancestry. North African Jews acquired North African ancestry. Ethiopian Jews retained predominantly African ancestry. Indian Jews acquired substantial South Asian ancestry. Persian Jews carry Iranian ancestry. Yemenite Jews carry Arabian Peninsula-related ancestry. Yet these communities remained connected through religion, cultural practice, historical memory, and varying degrees of shared ancestry. The Indian Jewish case is therefore not an exception. It is an especially clear example of a general phenomenon. Identity can survive migration. Identity can survive admixture. And identity can survive geographical separation for centuries. This is why the phrase real Jewish DNA is scientifically misleading. There is no single genetic sequence that determines whether someone is Jewish. Researchers can identify ancestry shared among Jewish populations and distinguish some Jewish communities from their neighbors, but religion and ethnicity are not reducible to a DNA test. The Indian Jewish studies demonstrate that perfectly. The Bene Israel are genetically Indian and genetically Jewish associated. The Cochin Jews are genetically Indian and genetically Jewish associated. Those statements are not contradictory. They are the same story. The ancestors who arrived from the Jewish world became part of India. Their descendants inherited Indian ancestry. They adopted regional languages and food traditions. They interacted with local society. They built communities. They maintained Jewish traditions. And after centuries had passed, their genomes still preserved evidence of where both sides of their ancestry came from. Now think about what that means for the families themselves. Imagine a Bene Israel family in modern Israel or Mumbai taking a DNA test. The results might show substantial ancestry connected to South Asian populations alongside Jewish-associated ancestry. A person might expect one answer, either India or the Middle East. Instead, the genome produces both. The DNA is essentially saying your ancestors were not one thing. They crossed boundaries. They became a new community. Their descendants inherited all of it. The same is true for a Cochin Jewish family whose ancestors lived on the Malabar coast for generations. Their genetic story is not simply Middle Eastern people living in India. It is a genuinely Indian Jewish population created by centuries of interaction. The community's genome preserves the history of migration and adaptation. There is also an important geographical clue in the difference between India's two oldest major Jewish communities. Bene Israel developed in western India, while Cochin Jews developed in Kerala on the southwestern coast. These were different regions connected to different trade networks. Maharashtra was linked strongly to Arabian Sea trade, while Kerala sat directly on the Malabar Maritime Network. The genetic evidence suggests these communities received Jewish ancestry through different demographic events, producing related but distinct genetic histories. This is precisely what we would expect from separate diaspora populations. And yet there is one striking connection. Researchers found substantial identity by descent sharing between Bene Israel and Cochin Jews. Some of that can be explained simply because both communities inherited Jewish ancestry and Indian ancestry. If two populations share both ancestral sources, they will naturally share portions of DNA. But longer shared segments can suggest more recent common ancestry, and the research raised the possibility of direct gene flow between the two communities. Historical records also document contact between Bene Israel and Cochin Jews after Bene Israel became known to wider Jewish communities. Cochin Jews helped teach some Bene Israel Jewish traditions, and genetic evidence suggests that cultural contact may have been accompanied by some biological exchange. This is another example of how culture and genetics can reinforce one another. A community meets another community. They share religious knowledge. They establish relationships. Some families intermarry. DNA records the interaction. History records the contact. The result is a story that neither source could reconstruct alone, and this is exactly why the Indian Jewish mystery remained unsolved for so long. Each piece of evidence by itself was incomplete. Oral tradition could preserve memory but not exact dates. Archaeology could show settlement but not always identify ancestry. Historical records could document Jewish communities but not reveal every family connection. Modern genetics can reveal shared ancestry and estimate admixture timing, but it cannot tell us every person's occupation, beliefs, language, or emotions. The strongest history emerges when all of these forms of evidence are combined. And when that happens, the old question changes. Instead of asking, were Indian Jews really Jewish? We can ask a much better question. How did Jewish migrants and Indian populations create these unique communities? That question has an answer. DNA can actually help us reconstruct. Jewish migrants arrived. They encountered local populations. They mixed. Some communities became relatively endogamous. Their descendants remained Jewish. Over generations, Indian ancestry became a major part of their genomes, yet Jewish-associated ancestry remained detectable. Different communities received different Jewish migrations. And those migrations occurred at different times. That is the real Indian Jewish genetic story. It is not a story of purity. It is a story of continuity through change. This distinction also helps correct another common misunderstanding, that genetic admixture somehow makes an ancient community less authentic. Genetics does not work that way. Admixture simply means ancestors came from multiple populations. Almost every human population on Earth is admixed to some degree. What matters historically is how communities formed and what identities they maintained. Bene Israel remained Bene Israel. The Cochin Jews remained Cochin Jews. Their genes changed because humans move and marry. Their identity survived because communities preserved traditions. That is not a contradiction. That is human history. But scientists still have major questions left to answer. The existing genome-wide studies are powerful, but their sample sizes are relatively small compared with the populations they represent. The major Bene Israel study included 18 individuals, while the Cochin study included 21 after quality control filtering. Those samples were carefully selected, and the statistical analyses were extensive, but much larger studies could reveal internal differences between families and subgroups. Some Bene Israel lineages may have different ancestry proportions from others. Cochin Jewish families from different historical settlements may also show different patterns. Ancient DNA from India could be even more revolutionary. If researchers recover well-preserved ancient genomes associated with early Jewish settlements or historical port cities, they might eventually identify the exact source populations contributing to Indian Jewish ancestry. Together, these discoveries show that India was not just a distant destination on the edge of Jewish history. It became one of the places where Jewish history created something new. A community could cross the sea and survive. A small migrant group could become genetically Indian without losing its Jewish identity. A religious tradition could remain recognizable after centuries of demographic change. And DNA could preserve evidence of the original encounter long after the first migrants disappeared from the written record. So when scientists say Indian Jews carry both Jewish and Indian ancestry, they are not describing a contradiction. They are describing their history, a history written in migration, a history written in marriage, a history written in isolation, a history written in trade, and ultimately a history written inside DNA. The Indian Jews were never what the simplest versions of the story made them. They were not one ancient population frozen in time. They were not a population without Jewish ancestry. They were something more remarkable. They were living evidence of what happens when a diaspora enters a new civilization and, instead of disappearing completely, builds a new identity that carries pieces of both worlds forward. The Middle East did not disappear from their DNA. India did not disappear either. Both remained. And after centuries of debate, science can finally see the traces of that meeting.